First of all, I just like to welcome all the viewers of this, the latest Danube Dialogue held by the Danube Institute, whose president I am. My name is John O'Sullivan. Our guest today is David Goodhart. David Goodhart is a journalist, an author, and I would say a free-ranging social critic. I think it's a fair description, David. You had a convention. You had I would say a conventional early career as a journalist of the centre left on the FT. You covered the domestic affairs, but also you posted to Europe. You started a magazine called Prospect, a very interesting thing to do. That was also on the centre left. It's still going strong. In the first decade of this century, however, you, so to speak, veered off message and started being interested in dangerous topics. Namely, you began to wonder if the immigration level was too high and whether Britain was perhaps too diverse meaning that quite a lot of ordinary English people felt themselves to be not living in the country which they recognised, which they thought also perhaps was changing too fast and maybe in directions they didn't in every respect like. And now that obviously put your centre-left credentials into some kind of question, and that set you off as a social critic of the centre-left and of the British social structures in general. You expressed an interesting set of new ideas in a book called The Road to Somewhere, and that became a success d'estime, I think, throughout the English-speaking world. I know we talked about it when I was living in Australia and in Europe, and I'm going to ask you quite a lot about it later. But I begin by welcoming you back to the Danube Institute because you and I and Jerry Frost helped to start a conference here in 2014, on whether the left had a future in Europe. I think it was a pessimistic conference at that point, so the pessimism has proved to be justified. But I'm going to talk about that too. Now, David, you have a very interesting background for a social critic. You are the child not simply of one, but two extremely distinguished Anglo-American families. Your father was a Tory MP, Philip Goodhart, whom I knew as well, as I covered Parliament in the 70s. But I didn't know your mother was a Wynant. In other words, she was a member of the family who gave the ambassador to England from America in the Second World War, John G. Wynant, and who became, in those years, I think the most popular American in Britain. So I want to say, since you come from such a distinguished background and combination of families, how was it you became a rebel, which you did?
I don't think I'm a very rebellious rebel, but yeah, I mean, I came from an upper middle class family. I went to a very famous public school. I had my father, as you say, was a Conservative MP. I mean, in the late 60s, early 70s, you come from that background. It's obviously very tempting to move to the left as a kind of expression of autonomy and adolescent rebellion, as I indeed did. I mean, it was a very predictable kind of revolt that took me through. I mean, I was really quite an extreme leftist at university. My whole life would have been completely different, but I fortuitously lost a vote for the York Student Union by just 6 votes. I stood on the far left ticket. If I'd won that election, I'd probably have become a Labour MP, or I would have certainly gone into. I mean, it's in the 70s and the 80s. It was a kind of pretty direct route. Once you went into full-time student politics, completely dominated by the left, you often ended up moving a little bit more to the centre and sort of joining the capital L Labour establishment. Anyway, perhaps fortuitously, I avoided that fate by losing that vote by 6 votes. It doesn't often make me think, on sort of such the sort of threads to our lives hang. I was, for most of my adult life, I've been a pretty orthodox sort of left liberal. But Prospect was when I founded the magazine in the mid-90s. It was kind of the rising tide of New Labour, and we were very loose. We were never that political with a capital P, but we were kind of loosely associated with that tide, that New Labour tide. And I didn't discourage that. I mean, we were kind of broad supporters of what New Labour were doing at the time. And I don't really, I don't regret that now, even though I've become much more sceptical about conventional centre-left politics. As you just described, I mean, I wrote an essay in 2004, Too Diverse, which was aimed very much, I still saw myself very much as somebody on the left, and it was aimed very much, indeed, it was reprinted in The Guardian, more or less word for word. It was 5,000 or 6,000 word essay, and it was quite abstract, philosophical almost, looking at holding up to the light this tension, particularly, I mean, it's a tension for all of us, but I think it's particularly a tension for parties of the left, which is the tension between their two central principles, you might say, in the modern world: solidarity and diversity, based on a common sense notion that people are more likely to trust, to work effectively with, to share their resources with people they feel something in common with. They don't have to be exactly like them. They can look different to them. They can pray to different gods to them. But there should be some, for that process to work, for society to work smoothly, requires some common norms, common grounding of shared norms, shared experience. These are just common sense ideas. And the more open and fluid and diverse a society becomes, the harder it is to create those norms that produce a healthy, particularly perhaps a healthy social democratic politics, which is premised on a high degree of sharing. That was my sort of first exposure to I don't want to, one could say the intolerance of the left. In a way, I prefer to say defensiveness of the left. And it was almost a sort of this was a very abstract and philosophical essay, as I said, but it didn't stop people like Gary Young and even Trevor Phillips, who I've subsequently become very friendly with, calling me various versions of racist. I guess I became very aware of the defensiveness of the left in this whole area. The whole kind of field, one might say, not just of sort of race and immigration and multiculturalism, but almost of sort of social psychology, that the left's defensiveness, really, when it comes to thinking about human nature, and particularly the modern sort of hyper-diverse liberal left, mainly creation of, or partly a creation of, modern academic higher education, a kind of a sort of sensitivity to the fact that many of the things that they say and promote do not sit easily with certain fundamental notions of what a community is, of the essential small c conservatism of many human beings. And they're kind of aware of that and don't really like to think about it very much and don't really like to probe it.
There is an interesting point here about Eton. You went to Eton, a very good public school, and I think a lot of people feel and argue that the existence of schools like Eton, and indeed all public schools, and indeed grammar schools or charter schools, militate against the solidarity and harmony of society and create artificial divisions. On the other hand, whatever else you think of them, they do produce clever people, they do have high standards, they do inculcate, or used to anyway, they transferred the culture of previous generations at a high level to their pupils, and they were part of a society that was diverse in a sense that not now very popular. and also created excellence, which meant, therefore, that every school in principle might be dragged along and upwards by them. I think liberals and conservatives, or conservative liberals, I take it your father, you might describe him, I would guess, as a conservative liberal, would see value in that, and yet it's not something that fits very easily into the analysis of either the left or indeed the centre-left or indeed now some moderate conservatives.
I suppose when I was talking about diversity just then, I was talking mainly about ethnic and value diversity. But you're right. I mean, the social class diversity has obviously been, particularly in the case of Britain, has been a big feature. Well, partly, as you know the history, partly because of the lack of a revolution, or at least the fact that we had a very early revolution back in the 17th century, and the continuity of our institutions. Hence, what's the great TV program that everybody loved, The Big House, Downton Abbey. Hence that. As late as the first part of the 20th century, you had this kind of apparently, on the surface at least, unreformed social class divisions that have been a source of great entertainment around the world. But I mean, so looking at the social class aspect of diversity is sort of slightly different. But I mean, raises complicated questions about liberty versus the ability to transmit advantage down the generations, obviously. And this again, I mean, it sort of comes back to one of these sort of fundamental questions of human nature, the extent to which people do want to. I sort of compromised on this myself. I didn't send any of my children to Eton. I didn't send either. I got 4 children, 2 boys. I didn't send either of them to Eton. I did, however, send them all to London private day schools. At the time, certainly, feeling somewhat uneasy about that, because there is no doubt that you can buy your children privilege. I mean, if your children are of average ability and they are well instructed and well brought up, they will achieve more than perhaps somebody lower down the social scale who has more raw ability than them, and that is an injustice. It's an injustice we live with, because the cost of undoing that injustice is too great, I think, is what most people would think. I think ideally our education system our state education system would obviate the need for private schools, as is the case in some parts of continental Europe. I mean, almost all rich societies have some private sector in secondary education. Britain's stands out more, partly because of the kind of the residue of those kind of Downton Abbey things like accent. Again, all societies have class accents too. It's just that outsiders don't recognise them. Perhaps ours are sort of better known around the world.
Well, that's right. And there's another, you mentioned Downton Abbey, but there's another film which is watched by people all around the world, television series, which is watched all around the world and very popular, and has been going on now for about 30 years, and that's Yes, Prime Minister. And I think that if you live abroad, you find a lot of things which disturb people at home in England are objects of either admiration almost, certainly admiring curiosity in other countries. And now, your father was an MP. You must have accompanied him on a number of occasions as a boy to the House of Commons. Do you feel that kind of parliamentary democracy, which is extravagantly kind of robed and it has the magic that people have talked about in the past, do you not think that kind of traditional magic has been helpful in attaining and safeguarding community in England in a way that perhaps the left hasn't appreciated?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, the left tends to be anti-tradition. I mean, what the modern what I call, we'll come on to this, but what I call the kind of the anywhere worldview part of the population tends to be anti-authority and anti-tradition, in a way that perhaps much of the population isn't. But I mean, I was really struck during the Brexit conflict, one way or another, the attempt by at least part of the establishment to thwart the result of the vote through Parliament, partly. I was actually in Vienna. I spent a month at an institute in Vienna in March 2019 when we were meant to. That was the time when we were meant to be leaving. If you remember, at the end of March 2019, and we didn't. And there was, we again sort of we were providing, like sort of from Shakespeare to Downton Abbey. We provided a kind of spectacle of politics for much of the rest of the Western world. People in Vienna were absolutely glued to their sets every evening. People were becoming experts on the peculiar practices of the Speaker of the House of Commons. So, I mean, although one felt embarrassed in some ways that we did seem to, our political class did seem to have made quite a hash of implementing Brexit. On the other hand, there was a kind of element of pride that these ancient parliamentary procedures and traditions were kind of not even perhaps admired is putting it too strongly, but were certainly a source of fascination for many of our European neighbours. I think, as I say, because of that peculiar, unbroken history, the extraordinary success of Britain for 250 years, the success in 2 world wars, the lack of a civil war, the lack of defeat in war, had meant that we have this sort of outer crust of tradition, which is just part of our culture. Some people don't like it, but I think it's what we are. Most people are perfectly happy with it, and it's something, as you say, the outside world admires. I mean, I think the outside world is slightly puzzled at the state of Britain at the moment, not with good reason in some ways. I mean, the Brexit vote was a surprise. We have a government elected at the end of last year, in December last year, which in many ways represents a kind of break with the, I suppose, sort of both centre right and centre left sort of consensus that really, I mean, emerged since sort of just after your time, John. In some way, it just the kind of period from John Major going almost all the way through to Theresa May, you might say, both in the personnel, certainly in the bureaucracy, in the kind of the Westminster, the yes minister people like Gus O'Donnell, who have been senior civil servants for sort of 25 years, retired just a few years ago. There was a definite sense of a kind of an establishment losing something. I mean, losing in the Brexit vote, but lingering on in some ways through the Theresa May government, and a radical break with that sort of 30 plus years of continuity, partly in ideology, partly, as I say, in literally in personnel. And I think this is actually one of the problems that the current, I mean, we might come back to this later, but I mean, just in parentheses, one of the problems the current government has is that it's an extremely inexperienced bunch of people for partly understandable reasons. The kind of Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings tactics to get Brexit done required jettisoning many very able and more experienced Conservative politicians who haven't therefore been at the helm during the COVID crisis. So we already had a very inexperienced and quite radical government coming in December 2019 with a huge agenda of, but both properly seeing Brexit through, seeing the Brexit negotiations through, and this radical programme for elevating the more depressed parts of the country, something that rather shamefully, in some ways, the centre-left had completely failed to do in the preceding 30 years. And it was kind of left to this sort of radical centrist figure, Dominic Cummings, to sort of who emerged as a kind of emblem of this levelling up programme, the dealing with the grotesque geographical regional inequalities that we have in our country. That combined with Brexit was a pretty radical programme as it was for a bunch of ingenue politicians in many cases. And then along comes COVID-19. And then we have Black Lives Matter. There's been a lot on their plates, and it's perhaps not surprising they haven't always. And they have the great hostility of the previous establishment. The establishment of the last 30 years is looking on with contempt, and you see that reflected, in part of the media too. The BBC represents some of that previous establishment instinct. And the BBC has been extremely hostile, sort of openly. In the mainstream news programs have been quite overtly hostile to the government, not just expressing.
That's a question I want to raise with you, because you were a journalist for 11 years, and I think you seem to have enjoyed it. But do you think that just as you, in a sense, were leaving journalism, journalism was leaving you, in that it's now full of people who really don't want to report what happened or even to analyse it intelligently in a fair way, but are really there to change the world? And you do see that, I think, in the reporting of what's happening at the moment about Black Lives Matter, and reporting over COVID-19, and above all, in Britain at least, in reporting on Brexit. Do you find yourself feeling uneasy when you're watching or reading a good newspaper, even, at the degree of bias?
Yeah, I do. I think it is worrying, and I think this whole question of the cultural march through the institutions of the left that people have become more aware of, and this new version of the kind of centrist right, rather more aggressive version of the centrist right, again. Symbolised by the person of Dominic Cummings, is very aware of this in a way that a lot of capital C conservatives, I think, have not been very aware of it in the last couple of decades. Perhaps partly because they weren't that bothered, perhaps partly because they were such liberal conservatives in a way, or they were, again, in my language, kind of anywhere conservatives. They were relatively happy. They were the sort of centre-right branch of this sort of broad movement of what might loosely called sort of liberal graduates, essentially, the kind of liberal graduate worldview that a lot of capital C conservatives were comfortable with and brought up with and were expressive of. And I think, we've seen, and actually the Black Lives Matter thing sort of revealed it perhaps more or as much as Brexit, the extent to which the establishment, extraordinary. I wrote a piece for the little online, it's not that little actually any longer, the online magazine Unheard on the Black Lives Matter business. Essentially looking, it's something I've taken an interest in since 2004, since that essay you mentioned in Prospect. I've taken an interest in race and diversity and immigration issues, having not really thought about them very much prior to 2004. And I went through the numbers and looked at the claims for black disadvantage, and then they're not all invented. Some of them are hugely exaggerated. There is a story to tell, but it's not the story that is generally told by Black Lives Matter, or indeed their establishment supporters. And I quoted in this piece an extraordinary letter from the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Justice. I can't remember his name. I think it's Heaton. Completely uncritical of Black Lives Matter, which is, as we know, at least in its capital B, capital L, capital M form, it's essentially a far-left organisation, wants to kind of destroy the nuclear family and capitalism, etc., etc. Now, it's true that the vast majority of people who support Black Lives Matter do not know that, or and are not interested in those goals, that they have a much more kind of basic attachment to and a legitimate attachment to race equality, which they rightly or wrongly see as being insufficiently pursued by British society and the powerful people in it at the moment. But anyway, this guy, who, in some ways you might say Permanent Secretary of the Minister of Justice, is about as close to the heart of the British establishment as it's possible to be. And this guy was saying, it's not enough just to show sort of verbal support for Black Lives Matter. We have to sort of get out there and sort of, fight alongside them. I mean, this is absolutely the heart of the establishment. But your broader question about, I think, there's questions of objectivity, there's questions of authority, and the extent to which, again, this was, I wrote something about this, or rather I did a little point of view, one of those little talks on Radio 4 a few weeks ago, about the hounding of Dominic Cummings when he was thought to have wrongly broken the rules, to some extent his own rules. There was when he took his drove his wife and child to Durham in the middle of the lockdown, and there was a huge outcry about about the rulers not following their own rules and all of that. And it did sort of strike me as, first of all, I think Cummings did have a case. I mean, one could argue, reasonable people, as he himself said, reasonable people could disagree about his actions, but the kind of complete uniformity of the media, and I don't know if you followed it, but he gave a press conference in the garden of Number 10. Yeah. And it was kind of like a medieval. It was like a man in the stocks having bricks or tomatoes thrown at him. The angry, sneering faces of virtually every journalist in that garden, representing what they thought of as the sort of the angry British public, horrified by the double standards of somebody in government. But that revealed to me, or it threw into sort of sharp relief the kind of anti-authority instincts of the people in authority. I mean,
yes, that's
whether
right.
we like it or not, people who are prominent journalists are authority figures, and they like me. We've all, we've come through a very liberal system of higher education that has inculcated certain values and principles, one of which is that you can't trust authority. Why is that lying bastard lying to me? Has sort of become part of the ethos of the modern media.
But I want to actually intervene here, because I think what you're saying is I think at least, one of the reasons, maybe the main reason, why you started Prospect. In other words, you may not have worked it out as fully at the time, but you were starting a magazine which, while it was on the centre-left, nonetheless had room for other people like Roger Scruton. You asked me to write for your first issue, and I think you succeeded. Now, the other thing that happened, that you also started, and this was not your intention perhaps, but it's a significant development, you actually started a revival of the general magazine. First of all, Prospect succeeded. Secondly, it evoked a counter magazine on the right in Standpoint. It's had its ups and downs, and now you have the Critic. And the two other, the main journals of opinion in Britain, I think, are New Statesman, The Spectator, and The Economist. All of those are flourishing. Now, I think they're flourishing because they, at least in part, first, they're very good magazines, but secondly, they actually do not share the culture of, as you say, angry anti-authoritarian, authoritarian anti-authoritarian positions on the left.
No, they don't. But the mainstream, the mainstream BBC News is, I was quite shocked by when I haven't been watching it for the last few years, and perhaps that was one of the reasons for my shock when I started watching again at the start of the COVID crisis. It would come straight after the main press conference. And actually what first struck me was just how dumbed down it had become, the kind of infantilism of it. It was essentially half an hour. The news at 6, the news at 10 was half an hour of emotion about this ghastly pandemic, and people weeping, and it was kind of slightly a sort of second Diana moment. And it struck me that it is extremely difficult for institutions like the BBC to speak for the whole country any longer. And that's partly a good thing. We are a much more diverse country than we were 40 or 50 years ago, much more value diverse, even leaving aside ethnicity, much more value diversity, much freer country in many ways than we were. And how the BBC can speak to enough people to be sort of coherent is a real problem for them, and I don't think it's a problem that they're really rising to. I think they've become far too fixated on appealing to younger audiences, hence that sort of sense that, I felt that the kind of average age they were addressing watching these programs was about 10 or 12. And I was regularly watching Das Heute Journal, one of the main German news programs, ZDF German news programs. I worked in Germany for a few years. I speak not fluent but adequate German. I can certainly understand their news programs. And their news programs through the COVID crisis were very authoritative, relatively unemotional, conveying information. It's true the German government has had a more successful, you might say, has had a better COVID crisis than the British government, but there was none of the sort of almost sort of sneering at the performance of the British government. And I did the same with French TV too, and they were again, and their kind of intellectual level was at least 5 years higher than the BBC. Again, sorry, I've gone on to a bit of a tangent. That's sort of slightly different point to the one you were raising, but I think there was America has already lost the idea of a sort of a single country when it comes to the media landscape. There are no, you not only do the different channels have their separate opinions and angles, but they have their separate facts. Fox News has its facts about the world. CNN and NBC or whatever it is has its facts about the world. There is no one really pretends otherwise any longer. I don't think we in Britain haven't quite gone that far, but we're kind of heading in that direction. And I think it's a really important question. How do we have a sort of a single kind of intellectual, literary media? How do we hang on to a kind of single conversation? We might have different views, but we're all kind of in the same public space, sharing certain norms, certain acceptance of rules of evidence, basic facts, treating each other with respect, etc., etc. How do we hang on to that idea of a single public conversation with many different flaws to it, actually, through which we come to a consensus about the direction we want our society to go in?
Well, as a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the movie Network, which came out about 40 or 50 years ago, 40 years ago anyway, it's amazing how prophetic that movie is about the changing nature of news, television news, because at the end of it, after the sort of corrupt executive has got her way, the news has become an infantile news magazine program with an astrologer and everything else. So there is that. But let me point out that your book, when it came out, did break through the kind of the media nonsense, and you did manage to get people interested on all sides in a new analysis of what's right or what's wrong with Britain. The British are always asking this question about themselves, and I want to ask you to just describe us briefly who this is a country, you said, divided into somewheres and anywheres, and then I think basically don't knows, people who haven't decided, who you can't quite classify. So what do these words somewhere, somewheres and anywheres mean?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I started writing this book, The Road to Somewhere, at the beginning of 2016. I originally intended to write something a bit more philosophical about kind of beyond left and right and all of that. But then as I was only a few weeks into writing it when Brexit happened, and indeed my writing of it was bookended by Brexit at one end, and then sort of 6 months later, the election of Donald Trump in the US, when I was just finishing writing. So it ended up being a rather more political book, and it was it's a kind of essentially an amateur work of social psychology. I mean, I spent my main empirical source is the British Social Attitude Survey, supplemented by various other kinds of opinion and attitude surveys, mainly drawn from the UK, although I think much of what I write has application in somewhat different form to other similar, rich democracies. So I was kind of drawing out from the British Social Attitude Surveys the new value divides, the kind of one central value divide supplemented by more minor subdivision value divides, you might say, it was pretty clear to me that, and it's there in the data, that there was a large group, you might call it kind of the mass elite, that is a product of the newly enlarged or relatively newly enlarged higher education system in the UK. So we're talking about 25-30% of the population. So not an elite in the tradition. Normally one thinks of an elite as sort of 2%, 1% of the population. We're talking about a much, much bigger group than that loosely shares a whole set of presumptions about the world that are drawn from their experience. I'm talking about the people who see the world from anywhere, as I put it. And they tend to be educated in the sense of having at least a university degree. They tend to be mobile, and that's particularly the case. This is one area where we perhaps do diverge somewhat from most of the rest of the rich world, in that we have an overwhelmingly residential university system. So being an undergraduate in this country means leaving home, and that's very, very important aspect of the story. I think that we're insufficiently aware of what an outlier we are in this respect. Something like 80% of British students leave home and travel, often, to the other end of the country, 100 miles, 150 miles, sometimes closer. Some people do stay at home. Some people retain very close contact with their parents and their families and their friends from home. But a very large proportion kind of sever their ties and start new worlds, start new lives, create new circles. And so the anywhere worldview kind of reflects that. It's educated, it's mobile, and places a high value on mobility, and related to that, a high value on autonomy. And it finds, because of those experiences, it often finds that the fluidity, the rapid change we associate with the modern world, something comfortable. I mean, something they're comfortable with. because of their own experiences. And they, I mean, I invented this label, the Anywheres, but as I say, I didn't invent the underlying values. And one could argue about the precise scale of this group. I mean, I put it at sort of 25-30% of the population. You can subdivide it too. There's a kind of more extreme end of the, the real global villagers at the top. I mean, often the more powerful, affluent, influential, the top executives, the leading professionals and academics, but, people who spend half their lives in airport lounges. I mean, very, very internationally connected. Often much more connected with people like themselves in other countries than they are connected to people in their own country. Hence Theresa May's famous, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. There is a sort of subset of the Anywheres. That isn't the Anywhere. Most Anywheres are perfectly normal people. They have, probably moderately patriotic views, perhaps not as patriotic as the Somewheres, but they're not extreme Anywheres. But there are some extreme Anywheres. And both of these groups are subdivided, and there is also a very big, again, this comes from the data, it's not just my labeling, but there's also a very big group that one might call the in-betweeners, who share almost equally the Anywhere and Somewhere worldview. I touched very briefly on the Anywheres. I mean, the Somewheres is the kind of mirror image in some ways of the Anywheres. They tend to be less well educated, certainly not people who haven't gone to university, people who tend to be more rooted, live closer to their parents throughout their lives, tend to, again, value the things you'd expect people with those life experiences to value, security and familiarity, more likely to be somewhat suspicious of change. And one of the important sort of supplementary ideas that is not original to me, but I borrowed from the American sociologist Talcott Parsons, is this notion of achieved and ascribed identities, that human beings are on that spectrum. We all have a mixture of the two, but Anywheres tend to have a sense of themselves. They have an identity that is derived from their own achievements. Their identity is an achieved identity. It comes from having done well at school, gone to a more or less good university, having a more or less successful professional career. So you have a sense of yourself as sort of self-created in a way, and to some extent you are, as a product of your own achievements, and therefore your identity is kind of more portable. You can fit in anywhere. You sort of carry around with you your sense of achievement, and again that sort of that protects you from some of the damaging aspects, you might say, of rapid social change, whereas Somewheres tend to have an identity that is much more at the ascribed end of the spectrum, and that means that their identity is much more rooted to place and group, and in the course of modern life, those things change as they often do in rapid churn big cities and even in suburbs. You see it in London, huge churn in a place like London, even out in the suburbs these days. So your sort of sense, and if your sense of yourself comes from a particular place, a particular group of people, a particular locality, and that changes a lot in the course of your lifetime, or even in the course of 10 or 15 years, that can be very disturbing to your identity. I mean, if you can't, it's not an identity that you carry around with you, that is born from your own individual experiences, as is the case with an achieved identity. And therefore your identity, if you're a Somewhere with a strong attachment to place and group, your sense of yourself is much more likely to be disturbed by social change. And this is one of the I think very plausible explanations for the populist reaction against rapid social change, including things like high levels of immigration. So I mean, those are the two. Those were these value groups, and just to stress here again, I always feel the need to do this because some of my critics there's sort of 2 points that my critics made. One, this is very simplistic and binary. Well, at a certain level, yes, it is relatively simplistic, but we do divide up the world into binaries. We talk about middle class and working class. I mean, no one complains about that being simplistic. Now, of course, it doesn't of itself tell you a huge amount, but it tells you something about a kind of a fundamental divide in a society. Well, I think this value divide is a pretty fundamental one too. If you actually read the book, you'll find that it isn't as simple and binary as that. And the other point is, both of these worldviews are perfectly legitimate, at least in their mainstream form. There are, just as I was talking earlier about the more extreme sort of citizen of the world anywhere, there are also people at the kind of xenophobic and generally authoritarian end of the somewhere spectrum, perhaps sort of 5 or 6% of people who are so discomforted by the modern world and by demographic and other changes that they have retreated into some quite angry and verging on illegitimate forms of politics. The kind of the more extreme element in the populist movement, you might say. But essentially, both of these worldviews are perfectly legitimate, and the problem for modern politics is how to mitigate the conflict between them. Our real problem is that for the last 30 years, the values of one group have over-dominated our politics, and I think there's been a gross insensitivity to the what I would call the kind of decent populist instincts of a large minority, if not small majority, of citizens of rich democracies. And so to that extent, I think that populism is in part a legitimate pushback against the overdomination of that anywhere worldview in our politics. And I think anywhere they're going to go on dominating politics, and they just need more emotional intelligence and acceptance that that it's legitimate to be a social conservative. And it isn't, and being a social conservative is not the same thing as being a social authoritarian. People can argue about Poland and indeed Hungary in this respect, and I'm not an expert on either of those places. But forgetting about Poland and Hungary, I mean, just thinking about Britain and France or Germany, not ruling as beyond the pale or politically illegitimate. Views that say we don't think all refugees can come and live in Stuttgart, or Shepherd's Bush. I mean, these are perfectly legitimate views for people to hold, and I think there has been a contempt for a completely mainstream. I mean, this mainstream sort of somewhere worldview is not authoritarian, as I say. I mean, but it wants. People want to live in relatively stable neighbourhoods. They want to feel that their borders are well managed. They want to feel that national citizen rights are put before universal rights. They want decent option for kids who are not going to university. They want a family policy that actually supports the family and isn't just about making it as easy as possible for both parents to spend as little time in the family as possible, which is essentially what family policy has become in the US and the UK anyway. These are perfectly decent, commonsensical, perhaps somewhat small c conservative things to want. And anywheres have been too hostile to them.
David, I think it's fair to say that although, as you've just pointed out, the division between somewheres and anywheres covers a wide range of topics, family policy and so on. It's also true to say that that your book and the Brexit moment, and to some extent the populist moment in Central and Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe like Italy, these things were made for each other. Your book came out at exactly the right time when people were looking for explanations for some of these things, and I think you very rightly reaped some benefit from that. So my first question is, are those moments over? I mean, has Brexit, so to speak, been solved? And now we will, in a sense, move on from that. Or has this fissure, which we now realise, which Brexit has revealed, and which your book has explained, and similar fissures in Europe, are they now part of our politics for the indefinite future?
Yeah, that's a very big question. And I don't think I really know the answer to it. Obviously, no one can really. I mean, I think these divisions are here to stay. I think left v right remains, one dividing line in society, and will never disappear completely. But I think it has become, it's shifted into the background in many ways. Partly actually because while these new value divisions have emerged, many of which concern kind of less quantifiable things than income. They concern things like status and the declining status of non-graduate employment, for example, and over recent decades, and social psychology. How much one feels a sense of belonging to one's neighbourhood, or indeed one's country. How one feels about the pace of change in society. These more intangible aspects of our political being, as it were, have risen up, have become more visible, and the old left-right divide, although not disappearing completely, some people saw it coming back very strongly in the 2017 election. If you remember, when the Corbyn Labour Party did unexpectedly well, I think that was a relatively I think it was a kind of one-off event in some ways, partly as a result of the Brexit vote. A lot of people who would not normally have dreamt of voting Labour voted Labour, because Labour seemed to have a pleasingly sort of confusing position on Brexit, and partly perhaps the result of 6 or 7 years of austerity. But broadly speaking, I mean, curiously, what's happened on, I think, a lot of left-right issues is that the conflict has diminished, in fact. Populists tend to be quite centre-left on economics a lot of the time. And conservatives, we're seeing this with the COVID-19 crisis, conservatives have been sort of rather dragged along. This is not a good time to be a small state free market liberal at all. We've seen, and I think there are also sociological roots to the convergence we've seen between left and right in some ways, partly because the old the kind of middle class has changed its nature and become much more left in some ways. I mean, you go back 50 years, you think of the middle class and you think of a shopkeeper or a businessman. Now you think of the middle class, you think of a public service professional, who's almost certainly going to be a Labour voter, has a social democratic interest in high public spending and so on. So the middle class, the expansion of the middle class has pushed the middle class to the left. Meanwhile, the working class has become much less left-wing, partly because it's had to, because it's collectivist institutions have essentially been destroyed by deindustrialization. So you've seen a sort of convergence on left-right issues. We don't have anything like the same divide that we had, even in my lifetime. I mean, the angry arguments in the 70s and 80s over, that you were very much part of, the kind of Margaret Thatcher's free market revolution versus the sort of traditional mixed economy, Keynesian statist positions. Those kinds of arguments are now much, much weaker, and they've been replaced by these not exactly new arguments, but they're much higher profile, and they're not going to go away. That's one obvious answer to your question. Whether they will. I think one of the interesting questions is whether the Boris Johnson, the Johnson-Gove-Cummings model is essentially successfully co-opting some aspects of the new populism and channeling it into, decent, legitimate political form. It's actually one of the reasons why I think that the experiment here is, I think, perhaps particularly is important for continental Europe, in that if the Johnson government can succeed or even partially succeed in successfully completing Brexit, in achieving some of its goals in terms of regional inequality and so on, not getting too much of the blame for the COVID crisis, then I think it will be able to stand as a kind of model for the channeling of populist sentiment into mainstream politics. Now, it may be that actually, continental Europe has not perhaps needed that quite so much. I mean, that is the product of a first past the post system, in which the populist voice was negligible in our political institutions, and that's actually, it's one of the things that's made me rather rethink the whole business of PR and proportional representation. I think, in a funny kind of way, continental Europe has been able to kind of absorb populism into conventional politics, because you've had populist parties in parliaments,
in governments actually too,
and in governments, in 6 or 7 countries, and funnily enough, I think that's probably helped in some ways. It's helped to moderate populist politics. For one thing, you have experience of government, you realise that populist slogans might be fine for electioneering, but they don't really help you when you're actually Minister of Health in the Italian government. That being an anti-vaxxer, when suddenly you've got an outbreak of mumps or measles or whatever it was in Italian schools, out goes the anti-vax nonsense, and in comes vaccinations. So the confrontation with reality is helpful for the maturing process of populist politics, and also and populist politics has its impact on the parties of the mainstream, whether centre right or centre left. I mean, you see the most successful, one of the very few social democratic successes in modern Europe has been the Danish Social Democratic Party, who have taken over many of the as it were mainstream populist policy approaches to both immigration and integration of minorities in Denmark.
But before we get too optimistic, David, let me go back to a point you were making, which is we now have what is traditionally a revolutionary class, namely unemployable or hard to employ graduates. And I wonder how you think, and I think you can say we also have therefore what we might call a lumpen intelligentsia, people who are available to provide a kind of not moderate, but middling level leadership for all kinds of left-wing arguments. You see that, I think, in Momentum and other organizations. And I wonder where you fit what's happening at the moment with Black Lives Matter into this divide or out of it.
Well, it's funny you should say that. I mean, because I've written that myself. I mean, I see Black Lives Matter as partly a kind of growing pain of the new black middle class. It's not widely known, but the black middle class, I think actually may just be the black Caribbean middle class, is now about 30%, 35%, more than 35% of black Caribbean men are now in one of the top 2 social classes on I can't remember if it's the 8 or 9 social class schema. And that compares with just 10% 15, 20 years ago. And now it may be that the advance could and should have been quicker. Much of it, by the way, will be in the public sector, the private sector. It may be increasingly woke in its politics, but actually the top of the private sector is probably the worst area of British life in terms of the kind of the onward march of Black Britons. But I think it's precisely, I mean, this is the lesson from almost all revolutions, as you say. I mean, the French Revolution happened because things had been improving so dramatically for a large section of the population, and they were impatient for even more. I mean, a lot of this is all down to expectations, and I think a lot of the black kids who've been organising BLM demonstrations and so on are graduates. They are they're the products of the newly expanded higher education system, many of whom, black and white, are coming out with expectations of high status, high paid professional employment, which is simply not there. For all sorts of reasons, partly to do with AI, and this will certainly be even more so in 10 or 15 years, a large parts of the, what we might call the cognitive class, the middle and lower end of the cognitive class jobs are being replaced by automation, the automation of sort of routine knowledge functions. Now we still need the very bright people to be medics and top lawyers and financiers and so on. But a lot of the expansion of higher education to produce the kind of middle and lower ranks of the new kind of cognitive mass elite, these jobs are going, and they're already under the group. I mean, there's so much of our education policy and social mobility policy has been premised on the continued eternal expansion of the kind of middle class professional job, and that is already stopped and is probably already now going into reverse. And so the young black kid, well, as you rightly pointed out, this is happening to both black kids and white kids. A lot of them are coming out of university with very high expectations, which are not then being satisfied in the labour market. One of the explanations for momentum and Corbynism was precisely that, mainly amongst white kids. And BLM, I think, is a corresponding black expression of the same thing. And for young blacks, things are probably slightly harder. I think black graduate unemployment is 6 or 7%. I mean, prior to the COVID crisis, anyway, was 6 or 7%, whereas white graduate unemployment is sort of 3 or 4%. So it's not very high, but it is somewhat higher than white graduate unemployment. And also, of course, they have a ready-made explanation for their failure to get the jobs that they think that they deserve and they've been expecting, and that is racism. They have a whole narrative that it will explain to them why it is that they're not doing as well as they hope to do, and you can sort of see and understand and even to some extent sympathise with the way that A leads to B leads to C leads to them being very angry, even if it is to some extent an imaginary thing, or not exactly an imaginary thing, but something that has a very different cause to the one that they are attributing it to. And I think this is a very, very real problem.
It's a real problem with really quite serious consequences for the future. Let me suggest two things. The demand for compliance to the statement Black Lives Matter goes well beyond, it seems to me, the ridiculous Marxist arguments of part of the organization. What it really is, it's a demand for agreement to the statement that America is a country governed by white supremacy institutions and is fundamentally racist. And America is a country that twice elected Barack Obama. And the same demand here, which apparently, as you said, the permanent undersecretary at the Ministry for Justice sympathizes with, is to say that Britain, which, as you earlier pointed out, is probably the quickest country to respond to immigration by anti-discrimination legislation back in the 60s, is again a fundamentally racist society which doesn't deserve our respect or love. Now, they seem to me to be very dangerous consequences. We see they have consequences, it seems to me, for freedom of speech, and for, generally speaking, good race relations, and for civil liberties. We see what's just happened to David Starkey, for example. I mean, it's one thing for him to lose a job, but all his books are now going to be pulped, apparently, by his publisher. And this is a really remarkable move in the direction of a society that is responding to these complaints, not in a liberal way, but in a punitive way towards the past and towards some of the people who seem to incarnate past attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how lasting this is going to be, or whether there is something a bit ephemeral about it. So something to do with the psychology of lockdown and both BLM, this kind of outburst of frustration that may actually have other real causes, partly just the business of being locked down for 3 months, and similarly I think the rather kind of pusillanimous response of at least parts of the establishment. I mean, that does worry me. I mean, I think the divergence between how a very large part of the establishment has responded to BLM and how I think most people out in Middle Britain, black and white, are responding. I think I think this whole story has pushed back the kind of conversation about race in this country by at least 10 years. I think we've seen almost all of the sort of indicators of prejudice declining steadily, for the last 50 years. I think we will now see them plateauing out, if not even rising slightly. That sort of sense of sort of special conditions for minorities in the kind of big metropolitan centres, having the ear, as it were, of the establishment in a way that the ordinary people out in the sticks feel they don't have. I think that this will generate a sort of a corresponding sense of unfairness of its own. So I hope that there is something ephemeral about this. I hope it's, but I think, these culture wars are now much more prominent and much more embedded, much more central to our politics than was the case even perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. And people on the right are beginning to learn how to kind of fight them, people on the centre and the right are beginning to learn how to fight back. I mean, you can't just let these things sort of go by default. Otherwise, yeah.
Well, I will apply your own theory to what we see now, and it seems to me that the somewheres are, in a sense, going to be the people who think that their country is being taken away from them in an even more dramatic way than it had been in the past. That a slow kind of movement of things being different has now become a specific repudiation of the country and its past. And the anywheres are going to be, like the civil servant at the Ministry of Justice, they're going to be sympathetic to the arguments for dramatic change as a way of for compensating for past injustice. So that's my kind of instant analysis based on your much deeper one. So my final question is, you have a new book coming out. Are you going to tell us how to solve that particular problem?
Well, I hope I get a few indicators. I mean, just to respond to that last point, I mean, I do think there are clearly generational questions here, and there are different expectations. People, I mean, I'm a bit younger than you, but people of kind of our generation, see, we remember just how biased and prejudiced our societies were 40 or 50 years ago, and we can see the change. And indeed, I think people from minority backgrounds of our age can see the change and improvement that's been made. And unless some highly ideological people would contest that, but I think almost everybody would agree. But if the younger generations are more impatient, they have much higher expectations. They just assume, of course, there'll be complete equality. I mean, why wouldn't we have complete equality? They come to it, with no sense of gratitude, with no sense that that all of these things take time, for people to perhaps, particularly in sort of political and literary and say judicial spheres, you're not immediately going to have representation in these institutions that corresponds to the minority share in the population. Apart from anything else, about half of the minority population in the UK is first generation. They weren't born here, and probably half, or at least a certain substantial minority of them, probably don't even speak English properly, so they're hardly in the running to be MPs or High Court judges or whatever. But anyway, that's another issue. But expectations are different if you're younger, and also don't forget that for the whole population, I think for the population under 30, it may even be under 35, there is now a majority of people who are graduates. So to the extent that the graduate liberal, not all graduates are liberals, and some of the sort of the liberal worldview is much more inculcated in people doing humanities and social science subjects, and is saying people doing engineering or whatever. But nonetheless, I think those two things combined mean that there is no kind of reasonable middle of the road status quo to go back to. It's going to be a pretty rocky road, and we will come probably to perhaps we will come to a new consensus that will be, but I fear it'll be hypersensitive about race, and hypersensitivity about race is also a big problem. The idea that we could evolve towards a society in which race became less and less important is now seeming like a bit of a fantasy. But just briefly on my book, I've got a new book coming out in September, and it's sort of partly building on some of the value division analysis of The Road to Somewhere. It's also still in a way trying to explain, almost in a sympathetic understanding of what populism, what at least decent populism, has been partly about. And the book is called Head, Hand and Heart, and you can sort of more or less guess what I'm going to say from that title, that I think one of the problems is that one form of human aptitude in the last 30 or 40 years, cognitive ability, has become too much the gold standard of human esteem. Obviously, we need clever people. Clever people are useful to society. They should be well rewarded and so on. But partly because of the expansion of higher education and so on, we now have a very large body of people, many of them with kind of anywhere worldviews, who have accumulated too much prestige and too much reward, and we've this kind of implies that that status in society is a zero-sum game, and I'm not sure it really is, but nonetheless, I think status has certainly been drawn away from many of the aptitudes connected with hand, the manual, technical, including higher manual and technical functions, and heart, meaning value, emotion, but also more specifically in an economic sense, meaning the public care economy, overwhelmingly female still. Now, I mean, I think one of the interesting questions is whether this, how one can. I mean, you might well say, perhaps particularly if you're a religious person, you're I think probably more of a religious man than I am, John. That these are things that aren't really subject to politics. These kind of shifts in the human spirit cannot easily be promulgated through policy measures. But nonetheless, I think politics can make some difference. I think we've just gone too far in one direction, and a certain kind of human aptitude has become over-rewarded. We need to nudge things back in the other direction. And you might say one of the things about the COVID crisis is that it now, it's alerted us to the fact that, if we put our mind to things, we can build a 4,000-bed hospital in 2 weeks. We can, we can print money. We can, have QE coming out of our ears. Lots of things that perhaps particularly conservatives would be rather alarmed by. Have now become everyday. But the other thing there are several reasons for thinking that this is perhaps less idealistic. This shift is less idealistic than it sounds. And that is partly to do with the fact that, as I said earlier, in relation to graduate expectations and graduate unemployment, it turns out the knowledge economy doesn't need very many knowledge workers. This will become clearer and clearer. So that the status that has been hoarded, as it were, by the highly educated classes, some of that is going to have to go elsewhere. And it's also the case that we already have, even prior to the COVID crisis, and perhaps the ongoing fear of pandemics that we're going to live with, and indeed possibly the ongoing existence of the COVID-19 virus itself, that we've had, even before that, we've had huge recruitment problems in large parts of the care economy. You know, there are 40,000 nurse vacancies in the NHS, 100,000 vacancies in social care homes, and so on. So that there are very real, if I was still a Marxist, I would say that that there is, there are deterministic historical trends that are actually pushing us in the direction of redistributing status somewhat away from head to hand and heart. And I think the COVID-19 crisis has revealed, interestingly, how the whole business of our public admiration, not just for people, not just for nurses and doctors, they're already people with quite reasonable pay and quite high status, much less so in the Cinderella services like care for the elderly homes. But more generally, we were also clapping for people who work stacking shelves in supermarkets and driving vans delivering pharmaceuticals to Boots. The people that remove our refuse. I mean, those the key workers were invariably people without university degrees who did things of practical everyday importance. Many of them are not particularly sophisticated things. They're not manipulating information in a sophisticated way, in the way that a lot of the cognitive class has been doing. But they're doing absolutely vital jobs that keep the show on the road of our everyday lives. And those things need to be respected and rewarded better. I mean, this is quite a social democratic argument in a way, and they will be, I think. I mean, there's no iron law that says that someone who's a refuse collector should be paid, a third of what an accountant is paid. A lot of it is actually, when it comes down to it, social convention, and those social conventions can be changed through the market signals of supply and demand. I mean, look at the business plans of big corporations have been hugely impacted by concerns about gender equality or the environment over recent decades. So concerns about a better distribution of status in our society, I think, could be a common. We don't have to chuck out the market system in order to have this adjustment.
Well, obviously, I think the problems you're describing have been part of British, the intellectual concerns of British life since the Boer War and the national efficiency movement. And we've still never managed to deal with them as effectively, for example, as the Germans have, with the much better technical education and apprenticeship schemes. So this kind of turn is long overdue, and I very much hope that your book contributes to it. But I also think you're also asking an awful lot of a society because you're mixing this desire to reform and bring about a more efficient society with greater opportunity with the desire to get people to change their mind and how about the value of particular jobs. Parity of esteem has been an argument in British life for a long time, and I don't know that it can be manufactured or directed by government, but I hope I'm wrong. David, thank you very much indeed.
All right. Well, thank you for asking me. Bye-bye.